If you want to use LLMs to write better with sentences, brainstorming, note-taking, all that jazz, Steven Johnson, our guest today, has probably thought more about this stuff than anyone on planet Earth over the last, 30, 40 years. Steven Johnson has written 13 books. Now he's using these tools all the time, and he's working with Google to build their NotebookLM product. So in this piece, we talk a lot about structure, like how do you structure your writing? Why is it so important? How does structure recede and fade into the background, but why it's so important for writers to get right? The dangers of over-editing, how to tell a story, how to think about flow, and all that jazz. I think that Steven is one of the most prolific nonfiction writers over the last 20 years or so. And this is a masterclass in the cutting edge of AI, how you can use that to improve your own writing at the level of the sentence, the paragraph, outlines, and your overall piece. So let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Steven Johnson. Man, it is so cool to be doing this.
I'm so delighted to be here.
It is so cool because I was just saying to you in the elevator coming up at the St. Regis, along a certain vector of writing and thinking about tools for thought and how technology can amplify the writing process. I think you've thought about this maybe more than anyone alive today.
Maybe to a fault, like maybe too much I've thought about it. But, I'm really delighted that there's an actual venue where I can talk about these things. So thank you for creating this.
Well, you have been writing with technology and thinking about how to do this for 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
And now you've had this opportunity to work with the team at Google on building NotebookLM and thinking about how we can use technology and AI to amplify thought. What is the number one thing that you have taught the Googlers?
I think the folks at Google, it's at Google Labs, so we're building this NotebookLM thing. And I think that I was originally brought in because, one, I'm a writer and a writer who's written a lot about tools for thought, as you said. But I think the surprising thing that actually surprised me in a way, it was something that I learned along with the rest of the team, is that the primary skill in getting a large language model to do something is command of clear, persuasive prose. It doesn't really matter whether you can program in C++ when you sit down to write a prompt to talk to the model. What you really want to be able to do is get the model to do something using convincing, clear, declarative sentences. And so it turned out to be that, while I have almost no programming background, there's a lot in the way that Notebook works where I actually wrote the prompt because we had a writer on the team, right? And so there was a quality of kind of a surprising importance of prose style in actually making the application work properly, which I think is just, nobody saw this coming in a way in the technology world, that writing skills would be so important to getting machines to function properly now.
And tell me, what were some of the things that were really important to you as you began to build this tool? The thing that stands out to me is the high status of citations and sources.
Yeah.
The sources are saved over time. So what you can do is you can basically say, I want you to pull from these canonical references of sources. And then also it's very good about citing its sources in a way that, say, a tool like GPT isn't.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, I'm sure we'll talk about is that I've had this long history of keeping digital copies of all the things that I read so that they were in the old days, so that they were just searchable, right? It was just, if I had a digital copy of quotes from books that I'd read as research, it was just 1,000 times easier to find that quote 6 months later when I was, working on the book or the article or whatever that I'd done the research for. What language models and AI have kind of changed all this is that it's no longer just about searching with the kind of keyword string the way, we used to do in the old days. You can actually ask open-ended questions. You can ask for summaries. You can ask for kind of highlights, all these different things. And if you design the system the right way, so that you're not just talking to a language model, but you're talking to a language model that effectively has read all of your notes or all of your quotations or all of your documents, what we call sources, as you said, suddenly you can do things that go so far beyond search. One of my favorite things to do is you can ask something like, in my reading notes, what are the most surprising facts about dolphins? And so it like on some level, the models actually are able to kind of understand, in quotes, what it means for information to be surprising, right? You're not just saying like, find me all the things that mention dolphins, but actually find me the most interesting things about dolphins in my notes. And so it was really animated by this idea that if you have a body of core knowledge that is your kind of core source material, and you attach that to a state-of-the-art language model, the whole workflow of kind of writing and thinking and researching is just going to be revolutionized. In one sense, it's just going to be like 10 times faster. Like your ability to get to the insight or the quote that you're looking for, or to get a page of summaries of quotes that are relevant to the thing you're working on in that particular moment, that's going to be much faster. But then, we can talk about this in more detail, like you also have this possibility of like really collaborating and kind of going to the AI and saying, hey, I just wrote this paragraph. What did I miss? Like, what else is in my reading history that might be relevant to the paragraph that I just wrote? And for the first time in the history of computers, the computer can answer that question.
Yeah. I almost feel validated because many years ago, I had lunch with a guy named Brian Norgard, who was really instrumental in building the UI UX at Tinder, of all things. And I think he was a director of product there. And he's a brilliant product guy. And we sat down and we spoke about this idea that I had for this writing tool, where what you would have was on the left side of the screen, you would be writing. And on the right side of the screen, at the top would be your notes, and your notes would change. And then there'd be like a public set of sources that would change. And I deeply thought about building this product. I was looking through my notes for it today and even the drawings that I did for it. I did some hand drawings and I was like, you kind of built this thing.
Yeah. You asked kind of what I brought to the Google team for this project. Like in a weird way, I do feel like I've been preparing to make this tool for almost 40 years. Like I've been thinking about this really since I was in college. So, 36 years or something like that. And so, kind of day one on the job, everybody's like, well, what should we build? And I was like, well, I've got 36 years worth of like ideas here. Like, let's go, And so I think we were able to kind of like, we built it pretty quickly with a small team, in part because there was this stored up body of thinking that I had.
Well, you were talking about surprise, and one of my favorite things that's been said on the show comes from Derek Thompson, writer at The Atlantic, and he says that interestingness equals surprise times novelty. And I want to talk about your new book, The Infernal Machine, and how you think about these elements of surprise, these surprising stories as you begin to weave together this tapestry of vignettes. What are you reading for to find these surprises and then thinking through what actually makes it into a final book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, surprise is so important and such an important part of learning, right? You pay attention to things that surprise you. Like the brain is constantly like making predictions about what is supposed to come next, which is, by the way, how a language model works as well, which is interesting. And that happens on a reading experience, right? You're like, okay, I'm reading this sentence and I kind of have a vague sense of where this is going. And when you're bored because you know what's coming next. And when you're leaning forward and engaging, it's because you're surprised by what's coming next. And when you're really surprised by what came next, you're confused.
Right.
So you have to hit this like sweet spot of I don't quite know what's happening, but I'm intrigued, but I'm not completely lost. And that's the challenge of it. In a lot of my books, Infernal Machine, the new one, is a great example of this, but this is true in kind of half of them, I would say. A lot of the surprise comes from connecting different fields or different narrative arcs, different disciplines in unusual ways. And so, in Infernal Machine, it's the story that weaves together kind of the birth of like forensic science and the early detectives on the NYPD and the anarchists, this incredible period of anarchist bombings that were happening in New York City, really the worst period of terrorism in the history of the United States, right around the turn of the century, about 120 years ago. And the kind of birth of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. And so you have like all these different threads, like the invention of dynamite, which makes terrorism possible. So it's a story that involves kind of science, chemistry, forensic science, anarchist political philosophy, like, the FBI. And when it starts, you're kind of like, I'm in Russia and I'm in London and I'm in Paris and I'm in, New York City, and all these different characters who seem completely unrelated. And slowly over time, they kind of converge in the streets of New York and for this kind of epic battle that unfolds. And so part of the surprise is just like the reader being like, how is this all going to come together? Like, how is this author going to get these 12 disparate people like in the same room on some level or in the same plot? And the challenge for that is you have to put enough kind of signals into the prose to convince the reader that you are going to pull it off. Because the risk is always, when people were reading Infernal Machine in early manuscript form, the thing I kept asking is like, in the first third, do you feel it all lost? And do you feel like, why are these people all in the same book? Or do you trust that it's going to converge? And in general, I think people felt that. But that was the thing I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, is whether it would, you'd feel that confidence that it was going to come together.
Right. You were talking about how that's what LLMs are doing. They're guessing. And I have to commend you. So you wrote that piece in New York Times Magazine. It took you like 7-8 months on GPT. And I got to say, that was my Quake moment for GPT. I remember exactly where I was sitting. It's a 10,000 word piece. And I remember the feeling, like, what I wish I had? I wish I had a heart rate monitor for how my heart rate changed through that piece.
Yeah.
But I got to tell you, the highlight of that piece is the way you end the first paragraph and lead into the second paragraph.
Thank you.
You did such a masterful job. I have to commend you. Can you talk about how you did that?
Yeah.
And what you did?
Yeah. So I had that idea early on. So there are two funny things about that piece. The first is I originally pitched it. This is hilarious. In the fall of 2021. And I went to my wonderful editor, Bill Wazik, who's a great writer in his own right. And I said, everybody's already written, plenty of things about GPT-3. Everybody knows it's really interesting. But I want to write a different piece, because it turns out OpenAI has this really weird organizational structure, governance structure, because it's like half a nonprofit and half a for-profit, and nobody knows about this. And I think that would be an interesting piece, which turned out to be very interesting, because that's what caused the whole crisis a few months ago between the nonprofit group and the for-profit side. So the Times was like, great, fantastic, write that piece. And so then I got access to GPT-3 in, I think it was like October of 2021. And I sat down with it the first night and just started experimenting. And I was like, oh man, there is so much more to be said about this. Like, this is so much bigger than I realized. And so I went back to them and said, I'll mention the governance piece, but I'm just going to write about what it means that computers have mastered language. Like, that was the kind of framing of the piece. And so then early on, I had this idea, given that large language models are just predicting the next word in a sentence based on the previous words in the context. And given that the surprise, in a way, I think everybody in the field feels that it was a surprise, that simple act of kind of training and honing the model's ability to predict word sequences would turn out to be so powerful and so flexible and creative in many ways, that simple action would generate so many possibilities. That's in some sense part of what the piece is about. And so it occurred to me that I could open the piece and write a paragraph and then omit the last word. And so that the reader would, and the line is something like, you're reading this magazine article, but then something very strange happens. It appears that the writer has deliberately omitted the final word of the first. And so then there's this blank spot, and then I kind of step back and say, but you filled it in, actually. You predicted, you heard the word paragraph there. And just think about the kind of intelligence you have to build in your own brain to be able to predict that next word, and all the kind of assumptions that go into the conventions of magazines and sentence structure and the meaning of the words you've just read that enable you to make that prediction. And that becomes the launching pad for the piece. So I came up with this structure, talk about, the kind of structure of an article. I came up with this idea. I was in a hotel. I just interviewed all the OpenAI people. I was in a hotel room in San Francisco, and I was like sitting there like back in the hotel room, drinking a glass of wine and kind of jotting some notes. And I came up with this idea. It's a reference, by the way, to the Italo Calvino novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, which I'm sure 1% of the readers actually got that too. But it's for people who are really into metafiction from the 1960s, it had added meaning. So I basically wrote that first paragraph, and I was like a month away from handing in a first draft of this piece. I had not written any of it. It was 10,000 words, so I had a lot to write. But I sent it to Bill, my editor at the Times, and I said, the subject header was, "Are you going to let me get away with this?" And he was like, "Yeah, I might actually. I mean, I'd like to see the rest of the piece, but we might do it." And then we ran it.
Well, it's very self-indulgent and beautiful, and actually like almost like moved with tears. Like it was so exquisitely done, and it wasn't cheesy, and you did it in a way where you said what you needed to say, but more importantly, you showed what you needed to show.
Oh, that's very nice of you. Thank you. Yeah, I was very proud of that.
What are you going for when you write those magazine pieces? Because you did the Bitcoin one about 4 years before, yeah?
Yeah. I've done basically 4 of these pieces for the magazine that have been very long. And it's just an incredible gift to give a writer, to give them that much length in a magazine. I mean, it's a lot of words. And it actually has been it's a format that I think we'll see more of, because it's a really lovely length in that it lets you really explore a topic in detail, tell a complex story with multiple threads, but you're not forced to fill out a 60,000 word book with that information. And they're just a bunch of stories or arguments that, really shouldn't be condensed down to a 1,500 word blog post, but really shouldn't be expanded up into a 60,000 or 100,000 word book. And on the internet, it's easier to, you can publish those things that way, or you can do multiple, editions of a Substack email or something like that tells a story that's that length. But the magazine lets me do that, and they've been really a lot of fun to do.
And how do you think about structure differently between a 1,500 word article, a 10,000 word essay, and a 100,000 word book?
Yeah, the biggest difference is between the short format essay. Obviously, in that point, you're limited to what you can do. There's just a certain amount of headroom you just don't have, so you have to pretty much make a point. And you can try and figure out, you're trying to figure out like what's the best opening paragraph here, and you're going to tell one story maybe in the course of the blog post or the newsletter or the short article, but you're not able to weave together things in the same level. But once you get to 10,000 words or 100,000 words, I don't know, I think of them quite similarly. Like, for instance, the piece that I did about this guy, Thomas Midgley Jr., the chemist who created both leaded gasoline and the CFCs that caused the hole in the ozone layer. One guy, it was called The Man Who Broke the World. He dies, he gets paralyzed with polio, and builds in a lab, because he's a kind of inveterate tinkerer and inventor. He builds a contraption to get himself out of bed with a series of pulleys and stuff like that. And then he ends up getting strangled by it and dies at the hands of the machine that he built. Now, it's believed that he actually used it to commit suicide, but the story was that he accidentally died that way. So here's this guy who invented all these things that had all these devastating consequences, and then he invents something for himself, and it ends up being an instrument in his own death, right?
Quite the metaphor,
right? So that was a great example of like the structure of a piece like that. We, Bill and I wrote this with Bill Wozik as my editor. We're like, it should be like Sunset Boulevard. There's a dead body floating in the pool in the first shot, and then it's like we're going to back up and find out how that body got there. And so like Midgley dies in the first paragraph in that piece, and then but you could have made a different choice. You could have been like, and the ultimate irony at the end of this whole story is that Midgley died. And the other thing about structure in a piece like that is that you aren't quite as bound to chronology in the way that you maybe are with a nonfiction, history book. Like the book kind of wants to flow in a linear fashion from kind of start to finish with flashbacks occasionally. But with that piece, we've contemplated a lot of different structures where we're like, maybe maybe after he dies, then we're like contemplating the landscape of like the carnage that he unleashed on the world and the ozone hole and leaded gasoline and all that stuff. And then we come back to like understand how he invented it and what he was thinking at the time. And I don't think you have an expectation that you're going to go on a strict timeline in a piece like that. Whereas in a history book, there's a bit more of an expectation. You do that.
Tell me about these relationships that you have with your editors. You've mentioned a few editors already.
Yeah. Well, another great editor story is, so I wrote a book, maybe my favorite book of all of them, except for the new one, which
is the new one always the favorite book?
Well, it is a little bit because you're not sick of it yet,
Right.
But I wrote this book called Enemy of All Mankind, which came out a couple of years ago. It's basically a story about a pirate, Jony Ive, who pulled off arguably the largest heist in the history of crime in 1695. And the story of how I got to that book we should talk about. But one of the things that was challenging about that book is that it had, again, this multi-threaded structure where it was telling the story of Ive himself and how he kind of assembles his crew. He mutinies a ship to take it over. But it's also trying to set this context because it's right as the East India Company is kind of taking off. The richest man in the world, Aurangzeb, the Grand Mughal of India, is a major figure. So you have to kind of like explain the kind of birth of corporate capitalism and in public companies and the East India Company. You have to understand why India was so wealthy at that point, the calico trade that was generating all this wealth. And so there's just a lot of scene setting to do. And the first chapter is kind of like bounced around, in all these different directions. And the main protagonist or, kind of anti-hero of it, Jony Ive, the pirate, would go kind of unmentioned in the first draft. He would go unmentioned for like 15 pages at a time. And when my editor, Courtney Young at Riverhead, who I've worked with on a lot of books, is fantastic. When she read the first draft, she was like, we can't ever lose sight of Ive for too long. Like that he's the one hook that the reader has. He knows that there's this pirate or she knows that there's this pirate. And if you leave the pirate for too long, they're going to be like, where's the pirate? I came for the pirates, they're going to be lost. And so she actually said that she built, they call it a crazy wall, which is like the scene from, the movies where somebody is, it's like The Usual Suspects or something like that. They've got all the suspects up on the wall and they're trying to see the connections between them up. So she built basically a kind of crazy wall for the beginning, the first third of Enemy of All Mankind, where she had like, these are all the pieces and like, how can we organize this so that one, it goes a little faster, it's a little shorter, and we never lose sight of Jony Ive for more than 6 pages or something like that. We had some kind of goal like that. And it's like having somebody who just like a second pair of eyes who's looking at something that early and thinking about the structure side of it. Because later on, when you share a book in manuscript form, generally people are not coming back to you with comments like, you should really reorganize the whole thing so that it's told in reverse chronological order or something like that. Like, no, like that's not the kind of notes you get. You get like, hey, I really like this. I want to hear more about that character. And I thought this was a little clunky in this part, or I disagree with the argument. But the deep structure that's kind of baked into the book, most readers, it's like a law of the universe of the book.
I mean, it really is like designing a house, right? So you're early in the house and you have the early schematics and someone's like, hey, you put the garage all the way on the east side. It needs to be all the way on the west side because otherwise they're going to walk in through the bedroom before they get to the living room. And that's going to be a weird situation. But if you've built the house and it's all there and you say something like that, you're like,
yeah. Could you have please told me that?
Could you have told me this earlier? Once the house is built, you need to be talking about the wallpaper. You need to be talking about the furniture. You need to be talking about what hangs on the walls. So the actual content of what is worth discussing changes over time.
So there are two really crazy stories about structure in my career, I think. And the first one is my book, The Ghost Map, which is actually despite the fact that it's about Cholera is actually the best selling of all my books. I think in part because it has this kind of detective story structure. It's following this terrible outbreak of cholera in London in the 1850s, and this guy Jon Snow, who's not the Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, who basically solves the mystery of where cholera is coming from, which is a major medical advance in the period, and it's a major kind of breakthrough both in terms of public health, but also the history of cities and all that kind of stuff. And so it's effectively there's a killer on the loose in Victorian London, and there's a detective trying to track it down. The killer is a bacterium, not Jack the Ripper, but it's the same architecture, right? So that part of it was pretty clear. Like there's going to be a kind of detective story structure to this. But I also wanted to riff on all these different ideas. I wanted to riff on the history of cities and the relationship between microbes and, the metropolis. And I wanted to riff on maps because there's a map in information design that's at the center of the story. And I wanted to capture like how crazy London was at that period and all that stuff. So I had all these themes that I wanted to explore. And at some point in the early stage of kind of sketching out that book, I'd done a lot of research, but I hadn't really started writing. I realized that I could do it where a structure where like each chapter would be a day. There was an actual chronology to it. So it takes place over about 2 weeks of this outbreak. And so each chapter is like, Sunday, August 30th, 1854. And there's a title and whatever. But each chapter is a day. And I realized that given the events that happen on each day, there was kind of a logical opportunity to riff on one of the themes that I wanted to cover that day. And so I figured out, oh, wait, day one, I can do the whole thing about like scavengers and waste recycling and all stuff in London because I'm introduced to the scene and I can start there. And then day two, I can do, the birth of public health because it's starting here. And day three, because of the events that are happening, I can do that. And it's to this day, like one of the things I'm most proud of that I've ever done in any of my books. And that book was reviewed extensively, got wonderful reviews. No one has ever mentioned that. And I think that it's one of these things like when structure works, you don't notice it.
Exactly.
And so it's
like design.
You feel it, yeah.
Well, we were just walking out of the elevator here when we came up, and I said, it's a Norman door. And what that is the door pushes, but there's a handle. So you think it pulls.
right.
And you're right? When you push, it should be flat.
Yeah.
Because that implicitly communicates to you that you push, and then when you pull, there should be the handle. And I've gone in and out of that door like 25 times since coming to the hotel.
You're
and
still
every
mad
time
about it. I can tell.
I'm increasingly angry about it. It's not like I'm going to ever make peace with this. And that's just like structure. That structure is invisibly telling you what to expect, what to think. And like you said, when it's done right, it just recedes into the background. But this is the thing that writers know, how important structure really is, because once you find the structure, a lot of things just fall into place.
Totally. So the other structure story that is interesting, which I think has a slightly different lesson, which is more or less the importance of structure, which is the same lesson, which is I've had several cases where an Enemy of All Mankind, the pirate book, is the most dramatic example of this, where the original idea for the book was the structure, and then the content came later. So with Enemy, I had this idea of like, it would be really cool to write a history book that begins with an event that is ideally very short and compressed in time, but something dramatic happens. Maybe ideally it takes place over like minutes, not, days. And you start with that event in the preface, basically. And then you go back 300 years and you tell the story of all the forces that had to converge for that event to happen. The, macro technological scientific forces, the individual lives, the economic forces, whatever it is. And then the middle of the book converges back on that thing. And then the second half of the book is like all the downstream consequences of it, right? I was like, that would be a really beautiful structure for a book. But I was like, I don't know what to put in that structure. I don't have the content for it. I just know that architecture would be interesting. And so I'm sure we'll talk about this in my Spark file somewhere, many years ago, there's a note like, it would be really cool to have a book that's structured kind of like an hourglass where there's a thing in the middle and I kind of described that structure. And then I sat on that idea for literally years. Like I think it was maybe like 3 or 4 years. It was in the back of my mind. I wrote some other things and I was like, I'd love to find the right thing to put in that structure. And then at some point I thought, oh, what if the event is a crime? Which isn't the most, shocking. True crime is obviously like a relatively lucrative field. But I was like, the nice thing about crimes is that they often are fast. Like they happen in instants, in a matter of seconds or minutes or something like that. And so what if there's a crime that had a lot of forces leading into it and a lot of downstream consequences? And so that narrowed it a little bit. And so then I could start Googling. Like I could start like famous crimes in history, kind of like just exploring the world of like reading books about the history of crime. And then I think maybe like a year later, I stumbled across a story about Jony Ive. And I was like, that could fit in. There's a note, that's in my files. It's just like, whoa, what about this guy? And it's like a quote from Wikipedia about him. And like, that could be kind of good. That might fit that structure. And then I dug around a little bit more and I was like, okay, that's it.
Yeah, I think that has shown up as a theme repeatedly is all this work that you do for many years without even realizing that work is going to have a payoff in the end. So you're talking about that there where you had this idea for this structure of a piece. I've actually never even heard of someone who said, I have an idea for the structure, but I don't even know the content that needs to fit into that. And then that's also where we started this conversation where you said, look, I have been thinking about these things for 36 years and only now does it feel like everybody's talking about it. And it seems to me that the core thing there is this spark file where you throw ideas in and then things begin to grow organically from there. It's like the seeds that you sow and then the fruits just sort of show up over time. You're like, oh, whoa. But you were just sort of tending to that garden without even realizing it.
Yeah, so the spark file comes out of the book I wrote, Where Good Ideas Come From, which the opening chapter, which is called The Slow Hunch. One of the key things I was trying to do in that book, which is really about how innovation works and creativity works, was to say like the whole dominant metaphor that we have for creativity is like ridiculously over-indexed on eureka moments and light bulb moments and epiphanies and like the apple fell from the tree and I have a theory of gravity. Like everybody loves to tell the story like that, but actually when you go back and look at like really interesting ideas, whether they're creative, bright early ideas or scientific ideas, they almost always have this very long incubation period where there's a sense of possibility. There's a hunch that there's something interesting, but you're not really sure what to do with it. You're like, hey, I've got an idea for a structure of a book, but I don't know what the topic is. Like I don't even know literally what it takes place or who the characters are. And they just stay in that hunch state and they kind of evolve and connect to other ideas a little bit, but they often stay there for long periods of time before they really germinate, to use the seed metaphor you're using. And so that if you believe in that theory, which I do, obviously, that means you have to be like writing all those hunches down because those are, and revisiting them because those are like the hunch is the most fleeting of ideas because it's not attached to anything. It doesn't have any actionable, utility in the moment. It's just like, I think there's something there. And by the way, like, we talked earlier about surprise, like that surprise is kind of I just try to capture things that surprise me, even if I don't understand them, and kind of like lean into those things, be like, okay, that was weird. I wasn't expecting that. And I don't even know what that means, but because I don't know what it means, I should store that away because maybe I will eventually understand it, Whereas I think a lot of times people are like, well, I would like to just focus on the things that I understand.
One of the things I just want to pop in here, because one of the things that's important is that you're not over-intellectualizing this. You're not saying, oh, it needs to work out in this particular way. You're just like, I just felt a ping of surprise. I'm going to trust that and I'm going to write it down. I don't need to justify every surprise.
Yeah. And this is, this is something I know you've talked to Tiago Forte, who, it's a pal of mine and it's someone we've worked with a little bit with NotebookLM, and like he's great on this too, which is like capturing things before you know where they go. Like the idea, this is why I'm kind of opposed to even tagging things, because I feel like you just want to capture things without spending any time. You want like frictionless capture as possible. And any time you spend being like, oh, this idea connects to these 7 other ideas, and I'm going to build the tags and the link system to like make sure that they're connected. Like to me, that gets in the way of just reading and thinking, but you do need to capture it. And so the way that I did that for many years is that I would create what I called a Spark file, which could have been called a hunch file if I'd been like consistent with my branding, I suppose. But anyway, I called it a Spark file. And it was just like, it was initially a Word doc, then it became a Google Doc, where I just put everything that occurred to me that was interesting at all. And it would be like random quotes from things and random story ideas and you know, oh my gosh, there was this pirate Henry Every, you know, maybe there's something there. And it was, I don't know, it was longer than any of my books. I think it ended up being like 120,000 words or something like that. It was a big, long file. And the key thing that I tried to do was to revisit it every, I don't know, 6 months or so and really just kind of read through it. Because the thing about the hunches is that, you know, the hunch you had in 2016 that kind of didn't make sense but seemed interesting, in 2024, like maybe you have the missing piece that turns out into an actual like story idea or a startup idea or whatever it is you're doing for your work. And so it gives like, it basically like gives you the opportunity to kind of like brainstorm with your past selves in a weird way. Like, oh, I had this idea 8 years ago and now I'm a different person and I see it in a new light and I can now finally kind of complete the thought in this way. So that has been very valuable. I've kind of switched over and I'm now trying to kind of do that inside of NotebookLM, which is kind of interesting, and trying to figure out how to design NotebookLM to kind of encourage that workflow. Because now, you know, we can get into this more, but now instead of just me rereading the hunches and in the Spark file and making the connections on my own, now I have this AI that can also make connections. And that just was never really possible before. Yeah, the thought that my computer might come to me and be like, Stephen, you just wrote this paragraph, but you've forgotten this thing you wrote a while back. That actually might be relevant to you. Like, that possibility is really electrifying for me.
Yeah, have you heard that there's a great speech that Jony Ive gave at Steve Jobs' memorial service, and Ive was the chief designer at Apple and so close to Steve Jobs, and he said the thing that Steve Jobs understood better than anybody else is that young ideas are fragile.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And the young idea has to be treated. And I don't know if he said this or if it's how I imagine it, that it's like a little dove. And it's like this little baby dove, and you have to hold it in a very tender way, and you have to nurture it. And if anything's too harsh, the dove will just die. And you have to sort of nurture it and let it grow. And then only later can the dove fly. But early on with those hunches, there's a certain way, like a tenderness, a care that you have to give that idea, because those ideas can be squashed so fast, so easily.
Like, it's almost like it's not so much that they need to be, you can almost like ignore some of the hunches. Like, as long as you capture them and don't just like criticize them out of the gate, as long as you just give them some time, I think that's really the best approach with that kind of thing.
And this is a theme that shows up over and over and over again since you wrote that 2005 piece in New York Times called Tools for Thought. How can we improve, amplify our thinking by using these technologies?
So yeah, I first got the little taste of that I was a sophomore in college. It was 1987, and Apple came out with a program called HyperCard that most people have forgotten now. This is before the web had even been kind of designed at that point. Berners-Lee was still 2 years away from the kind of first version of that. I was not connected to the internet in any way. I didn't really get on the internet until I went to grad school. But HyperCard was a kind of preview of the web. It had a kind of hypertext architecture. You had these cards where you could put information on them, and you could basically make links between the cards. And it was kind of a note-taking tool. It was kind of an open, kind of human natural language programming language kind of tool. And it never really took off, but everybody who got into it, like I did, changed the course of their lives. And I got obsessed with like, oh, I could build a tool to help me with my research for my classes. And I'm going to take my notes in this tool and I'm going to optimize it for the way that I like to work. And I'm going to have this kind of research control assistant here. And so it had a little programming language. And so this is like kind of taught myself how to program, and then I built this program called Curriculum. That's what I called it. And it was, the joke about it is that I like got so obsessed with building a tool to help me with my classes that I stopped going to my classes because I was like, I just want to build this tool, And I used it for a little bit, but it's one of these things where you get a taste of something that is possible, and like the technology is not ready yet, but you get this little glimpse of what might be possible, and it just sticks in the back of your mind, and you spend the rest of your life chasing it. And so that's kind of the journey I've been on. I started using in the early 2000s, I started using this program called DevonThink or DevonThink. I don't even know how it's pronounced. It anticipated some of the stuff that's now in large language models in the sense that it could detect semantic relationships between blocks of text. And so even if the two paragraphs in question didn't have any words in common, if one was about, kind of game theory and one was about tit for tat behavior in bats that are conceptually linked to each other, it was amazingly able at the time to say, hey, these things are closer to each other in kind of the semantic space than these other paragraphs, right? And so what I did was I started laboriously typing up all the quotes from books that I read. I would sometimes have research assistants do it, or I would do it. I would try OCR, but it was terrible. But I would basically try and get these digital copies of all the quotes from the books that I was using as research or articles or whatever. And I would put them into DevonThink. And then I could find things very quickly, which is great and, helpful. Like, what was that quote from the Jane Jacobs book? Oh, there it is. Okay, great. I could just paste it in. And I would always put the page numbers there. So I had citations, which was, another obsession, like making sure you know the provenance of these ideas and getting that right. But there were these hints of like, maybe there's a higher level kind of collaboration here. And the example that I talked about in this Times magazine, it was a Times book review piece, Tools for Thought. When I was writing Ghost Map, I had a theme about waste recycling and, just how a city deals with basically human excrement, which is like the major problem when suddenly you've grown to like 2 million people in the space of 50 years or whatever. And so I had a big thing about like waste removal and recycling and things like that. And I did a search in DevonThink on that, and it brought back this seemingly unrelated quote about how our skeletons are basically an evolutionary kind of adaptation of calcium, which is a waste product of cell metabolism. So cells were expelling all this calcium, and then evolution was like, hey, actually, I could use that. Maybe we could build a backbone with that. And so seemingly unconnected ideas, but I was like, oh, actually, this is cool. I can do a whole riff that goes from like the way that cities recycle, the way evolution recycles, all kind of stuff. And that became like 7 pages of Ghost Map. But when I stepped back, I was like, who had that idea? Like, was it me or was it the software? And on some level, it was kind of both of us. Like I described it, I think in that piece as like a duet. Like it felt like there were two different kinds of intelligence kind of working together in that. And a big part of it that is crucial, and it's crucial to what we're trying to do with NotebookLM as well, is I curated all those quotes, right? So there's kind of like my human intelligence reading all those books, deciding that these are the most interesting and surprising and, useful facts or passages in all those quotes. And then there's the software's ability to maybe detect connections and certainly scan the entire body of work faster than I could. And then it surfaces a bunch of connections, potential connections, and then we get back to my human intelligence at the other end of the chain saying like, oh, that's a keeper. And so we're doing different things at different stages, but like that was a new kind of creative workflow for me that I got a sense of in that.
Well, it's funny because you were talking earlier about these glimpses of the future where you see that something could exist, but it doesn't yet exist. And you just have this dream. And the dream that I have that I really want to manifest in the world is I want to be able to sit down at lunch with you. And what I want to be able to do is basically have some sort of hologram type thing that is basically this third-party source notes that is researching what we're talking about. So you and I are riffing, and here we go. So I have gone on a walk in Central Park every day for like the last 4 or 5 days, and the architecture is fantastic. So there's been a few buildings, and now I'm starting to think, okay, why is the architecture in Central Park so good? Because it's so good that something's going on. Okay, so we started talking about that, and then you're like, hey, well, what's an example? And then there's that place, like if you sort of walk up from, call it like 6th Avenue, and you sort of walk up and there's that area with the fountain, then you walk through this beautiful place, but I don't know what it's called, but I know that it's really beautiful on top. But now as we're having this conversation, I could basically like pull open the hologram and you and I could look at it. Now we could begin to rotate it with our hands. And then you and I could be looking at this image that's right there together. And I know that the technology is basically there. Now with Apple Vision Pro, we're going to be able to see something like that. And it's like that glimpse into the future. And it's the same sort of thing where over time as well, the tool, the technology, it becomes symbiotic with who you are. So you begin to know it, it begins to know you, and you begin to work together. And it leads into that question, well, who discovered what? And it's almost like when someone has one of those imaginary friends when they're a kid, it's you're just in that duet together.
Yeah. I feel this way a little bit with my kids because they're so fast at typing on their phones that we'll be sitting at the dinner table. We don't, have phones out at the dinner table, but like some fact will come up and we'll be like, well, I don't know actually if that, during Kennedy's administration, if that's what they passed, this is what we talk about at dinner. and they'll just be like, yes, it was. Like they can just get to the fact so fast on their phones that I feel like they already have a kind of a version of that instant kind of knowledge bank that's there. But it's going to be really great. And I think, the part of the question is with the AI part of this all is to what extent does your kind of language model co-creator, collaborator really get to know you over time? Right? Like these are your obsessions.
Well, this is something that stands out with NotebookLM is how much state there is. So most LLM tools, you have the interaction and there's a state within the interaction. So within that chat file on ChatGPT, it knows where you are, what the conversation is like. What you've built in is that you can save individual parts and then over time, it retains a much deeper understanding of the individual who it's working with.
Yeah.
And that seems to have been a very deliberate design decision for you.
I think one of the most powerful things about NotebookLM, which we're still, one, we're learning how to explain it to people, and two, we're still rolling out some of the features that really do this. But in a way, we tried to redesign the whole kind of note-taking research tool application, all the conventions of it, from the ground up, knowing that you have a language model there. Instead of like adding a language model into an existing UI, we tried to like think about how you would do it differently with that as a kind of a given. And part of what the interface is designed to do is to give you really easy ways to focus the AI on different things. And so the first thing you do is like you load up your sources that are, let's say it's reading for your class. So you've got a bunch of textbooks that you would load in there or something like that, or it's your research notes for the book that you're writing. So then the model is like kind of grounded in that information. So you are effectively saying, hey, large language model, I want you to be focused on this text. And anything I ask you, I want you to answer based on this text, and I want you to show citations. I want to see the work. I want to be able to jump immediately to the quote that you're using to answer this question. But then you can take some notes, and you could be reading through, your textbook, and you could get to like a complicated passage, and you can just select that passage and say, hey, now I want you to explain this passage. So I don't want you to pay any attention to anything else. I just want you to look at this paragraph and help me make sense of it. Then you take a bunch of notes, and then you can select all those notes, and you say, now I want you to focus just on the notes that I've selected, and I want you to turn those into a draft of a blog post, or I want you to create a study guide for me so that I can learn this material more. And so what you're doing now, technically you could do this in ChatGPT. You could go into your textbook, copy the text, switch tabs, go in there, paste it in, write, please help me understand that, get the understanding of that, take that back to your notebook and paste it in there. But the kind of cognitive load of switching, but like the switching costs of going back and forth between all those different applications and tabs and things like that is just it's like really bad for your thinking and your creativity. You're not in a flow state when you're doing it. You're just kind of like, oh, now I have to copy from here and paste in here and I hit return and I do this. So Notebook is designed to kind of like do that all in one unified kind of place. And I find it incredibly powerful, but it's a different way of working. And so like we joke in the office, like no one knows how to use NotebookLM, better than I do. Like I have spent so much time with it. So the trick is now like explaining it to people and like getting people to understand this slightly different workflow.
Tell me about this tagline then, to go from information to insight. What is that process like, and why is that this very central one-liner?
Yeah, so one of the things that I did the other day, which was just amazing that you can do this, I have a notebook inside of NotebookLM where I just write all my random thoughts, my kind of hunches about the software itself and what we're doing. And so it's everything from I start drafting a little blog post about it, or I have a kind of crazy idea for a new feature, or notes to myself, and it's just a bunch of random things. And so the other day I just selected the whole notebook for like, I don't know, 45 different notes. I think it's like 7,000 words worth of stuff. Selected the whole thing, and I just said, what is the most interesting idea in this collection of notes? And it came back with, I thought, actually a good one. So one of the things that Notebook does is when you ask a question based on your sources, we suggest follow-up questions based on what you've asked and what your sources contain. And so if you're reading that American history textbook and you ask about the Columbian Exchange, it will say like, oh, what about asking about smallpox and the impact on, indigenous communities, or whatever. It'll give you 3 or 4. And so you can explore a complex new document by following these kind of chains of questions. And it's a really interesting way to kind of get your bearings in something. And I was describing it to myself in this note as that it was like conversational hypertext. And there actually aren't links, right? They're not blue words that you're clicking on. You're just like, I ask this one question, and I ask a follow-up question, I ask a follow-up question. And that is a really powerful way to learn. But it wasn't possible before unless you were lucky enough to like talk to the author of the book, or like a teacher that was really well-versed in the book that you could ask a question of. But you couldn't do it in any other form. And now we can.
Well, what I always say is that the LLMs are really good at 3 things. They're good at diversity, they're good at accessibility, and they're good at speed. So you say, well, you could do that if you could talk to the author. And I'm not here to dispute that, yes, if you want to learn a subject, you're trying to learn about Robert Moses, and Robert Caro was sitting right here. I'm not disputing that he would be your guy.
Yeah.
But what LLMs are so good for is you can get the diversity through the interpretations of different people. So I could get Robert Moses, and I could get 6 other New York historians. I could create a debate between a few of them. Accessibility, this tool's free. And then the speed, the instantaneity of it. Who knows how would we even get Robert Caro here right now? I wouldn't even know how to begin doing that. I can do all 3 of those things instantly. And when I think about where LLM technology is so good, it's along those 3 vectors: diversity, accessibility, speed.
Caro's got to be like 20 blocks from us right now.
I bet he's like 15.
I bet he's like 15. We could probably find him. But yes, it's a great point. The speed thing is a really interesting one. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of something that people really, I think, underappreciated about Wikipedia when Wikipedia kind of got big enough and reliable enough to use. Which is that Wikipedia, and to a lesser extent the web as well, kind of post Google web, it enabled you to do very quick explorations of ideas. And for me, this was an unbelievable godsend because I'm constantly, jumping into fields that I have no actual expertise or training in, and, kind of be like, what's the deal with that? What's the deal with the history of air conditioning? And, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I should read more about that. And so I think that speed thing is really incredible. And that's part of what, we're seeing again on a new level, like your ability to, in a sense, like kind of create a like dossier or kind of a briefing document on your notes, like that, you might do or a research assistant might do that is very tedious work, right? Like you interview somebody and you want to like, what are the highlights and main themes of this interview? Let's turn it into some kind of structure. That's hours and hours of work. And you can literally just like select that source in NotebookLM and say like, create a briefing doc with key quotes organized by themes. And it's like, it's not always perfect, but like the first draft of it is crazy. So that's winding all the way back to your question about like getting information to insight. Like It's like, there's a bunch of raw data here. I'm trying to turn it into like usable insights. It's just an extraordinary platform for that.
Well, to your point about information to insight, one way to think about information is that you have a lot of needle, but you also have a lot of haystack. Insight is about just the needle. And one of the things that I find LLMs to be very good at is give me the one-liner, give me the one sentence. And what I like to do is I just like to hit refresh, just to see how is it trying to compress and distill this idea, not so I can necessarily just take what it gives me, but so all of a sudden it's like a cubist painting where I can see the same thing from this angle, from that angle, a little bit from above, a little bit from below, over and over again. And it sort of gives me, it's sort of like when you're watching those NBA games or a football game and the camera sort of swings around from one lens to the other. Woo! And I like looking at ideas from 360 angles like that.
You know, one thing that we haven't rolled this out yet, but I'm really excited about this, is something I've always wanted as a writer. We haven't talked a lot about like writing on the level of sentences.
Let's get into it.
My skills skew towards the stuff we've talked about, the architecture, the kind of storytelling, those kind of bigger things. And I find that I have to work hard to make my sentences interesting. My default setting is to make this as intelligible as possible on the level of the sentence. So I think of like the sentences are very clear. The overall structure of the book and the argument of the book, the story the book is telling is actually very adventurous and maybe experimental. But you're rarely laboring on the level of the sentence to understand what's going on. And I think that is good. That has helped me in many ways. But I sometimes find, particularly with books like Enemy of All Mankind or Infernal Machine, which I want to feel somewhat novelistic, that I have to work a little bit to make the sentences more just aesthetically interesting. And it also hurts me that I'm not a particularly visual person. Like my visual memory is very weak compared to my semantic memory, my linguistic memory. Like I can think of a paragraph when I'm on the subway and come home and like transcribe it like word for word almost. But I'll meet someone and my wife will be like, what did they look like? And I'll be like, I don't remember. They were a man as far as I could tell.
Wow.
I just don't have much of it. So
do you think that that's a trade-off?
Well, yeah. Is it actually a trade-off? Like, is it
because presumably you're so good at this that maybe you're actually just really bad at that.
I don't know whether it's just because I've focused on that and that other part of my brain is atrophied, or if I came into the world with less visual memory, it's probably some combination of that. But I used to joke that I would like never be able to be a novelist because I would like introduce the characters and be like, he had a nose and 2 ears. Just like, could you give us a little more? So, but on the level of sentence too, like I sometimes find that I think everybody falls prey to this. You get stuck in a certain way, in a certain rhythm, certain, pacing of the sentences. Or sometimes you just write it out and you're like, this is just a little bit boring, but I can't think of another way to phrase this. And so we built this thing that we haven't turned on yet, but it's pretty cool that I was calling Paragraph Thesaurus. And it's basically like a thesaurus for the entire paragraph.
Love it.
So I was like, take this whole paragraph and just rewrite it, but keep the meaning the same, but just like create different metaphors, create different things, whatever. And it's not so much that I would necessarily use it directly, but it's just a way of like getting out of your routines.
Well, I think the core thing here is that the brain is much better at contending with something that already exists than going from 0 to 1. So
totally.
What you're doing there isn't asking the tool to make you a statue. You're asking the tool to give you different kinds of marble. And then you can take those those different kinds, and then turn it into the statue. And what is happening right now is that the computers are getting really good at going from nothing to a decently good something. And a lot of the shallow critiques are, I'm not getting a good something.
So two stories. First off, when I remember coming home and telling my wife about this paragraph thesaurus idea and being all excited about it. And she's like, that is a plagiarism tool. Like that is like, take this paragraph and rewrite it so that it's no longer plagiarizing. And I was like, you're right. So there's all, I should say, like there are issues with that, you have to figure out how you deploy these things.
At this point, should we just all be citing NotebookLM, ChatGPT at the bottom? I mean, I almost want a disclosure on my site.
Yeah.
This I have pulled from NotebookLM, ChatGPT every time. You should just assume that at this point.
Yeah. I have some ideas about how, particularly in the classroom, you could deal with that. It's a version of that. But the other thing that is funny about the paragraph thesaurus, which gets to the craziness of the language model. So I was testing it on Gemini Ultra, which is like the kind of like the top line Google language model that hasn't really been released. I think maybe Bard Advanced now uses it, and we're starting to use it at Notebook. And so I was using another program to kind of test this thing. I'd written the prompt. I was basically like, take this kind of somewhat flat paragraph and basically like make it more interesting and exciting, whatever. And so I gave it a very bland, factual paragraph about the climate of Hawaii. And I was like, okay, transform it with new metaphors and just make it more interesting. And it came back with the most crazy paragraph that was like, the climate of Hawaii is like a symphony that has been conducted by Mother Nature, and the many motifs are going to, so like this totally useless like version. And so all I typed in response was, dude, that is a little over the top. And the model said, you're right. I'm sorry. How about this version? This is a little bit less excessive. And it was perfect. Wow. And what I thought was just so crazy is that I could type, dude, that is a little over the top. And that was a legitimate instruction to give a computer. And it would give you the answer you were looking for. It was just crazy.
Tell me more about the sentences. What do you do to refine sentences, refine words? And one of the things that I've sensed, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're fairly skeptical of over editing, that you're like, I don't want to go crazy on my editing.
One key advice for writers who are going to be published somewhere and are lucky enough to have an editor is just trust the edit. Like, you don't have to get it right, because there is going to be an edit. And if you have a good editor, like, things will get fixed. And if you spend too much time in that first draft trying to get it perfect, it's just a waste of your time. Like, you want to kind of charge ahead and get it done. But the other maybe less typical advice and kind of strategy that I developed over the years is that's specifically to do with the book, but I think it's true to some extent of the longer article, is that you are really battling your own familiarity with the text, because a book is like a song that you've heard too many times. If you read it 20 times, it loses its appeal, right? And so I learned early on in my career that my natural inclination was to sit down every day and reread the chapter I'd been writing, and then start writing, which one was a waste of time. Might take 20 minutes to read up to wherever I was in the chapter. But two, it meant that by the time I finished the chapter, I had read it 20 times, or how many days it took me to read it. And so it had just, all the pleasure and joy and surprise of reading my words was just wiped out, and I just knew it all by heart. And everything seemed really obvious. Everything seemed really predictable. So much of writing is projecting yourself into your reader's experience and mind, and being like, are you confused? Are you excited? Are you energized by this? Are you on the edge of your seat? Are you bored? Like, is this working? And if you yourself have read your book 100 times and you sit down to like do the first pass edit of it, and you read it basically 100 times because you've been reading the chapters as you go, you can't get into that mental state because you're so sick of it. So you can't read it like a new reader basically would. And so the technique that I kind of developed to deal with that is to really try actively not to reread as I'm writing the chapters. So I really sit down. I do the Hemingway thing of like, leave yourself a little nugget. So I often, like, the last couple of words will be like, and then do this and then do that, like little instructions to myself about where to go next. So I have something to go on. And I just write. And then I finish the chapter, and that I will print out and kind of like read on the iPad, and do a one pass edit on it. And then I try and put it to bed and not reread it. And so that means that, like, for the longer books, like Infernal is like almost 100,000 words. And it took me a long time to write. By the time I get to the end of it and really sit down to read the whole thing, there's whole sections that I've forgotten, and every now and then I've had cases where, like, not only have I forgotten whole sections, but I've actually like duplicated sections. Like, oh, I forgot I already did that riff, and now I'm doing it again here because I've totally forgot it. But it gives me the sense of, and it's also, I find that changing the place where you read,
of course,
and the format is really important. So like I used to print it out. Now I do it on the iPad so that I can capture the edits as a PDF and go back and look at them. But changing the typeface and where I'm reading it. So I kind of am like, I make it look like a book. And so I switch over and I read in my chair, not at the desk.
Tell me about word choice or sentences. Are there any sentences that you feel like have really been some of your favorite sentences that you've had to develop over time, but you feel like through that work, you ended up with something you were really proud of?
Ghost Map, I had this idea from the beginning that I wanted to literally just immerse the reader in, like, literally in the shit of London that was literally like drowning in human excrement and was killing people. And you had this kind of like scavenger class of folks who were playing all these kind of impromptu roles at recycling waste. Some of them involving literally like human waste, some of them involving just trash was out there. And so there's this whole like typology of these different kind of waste removing roles in the city that were not organized by the state at all. They were just, kind of organized by just people being incredibly poor. And so I was like, I just want the book to just plunge into that world. And there were two parts of that. Like the first line of that book is like, something like, it is the summer of 1854 and London is the city of scavengers, is like the opening line. And then there's this just like long litany with all their names. They have all these like crazy kind of like Victorian London kind of Cockney like names. And so it was the combination of like this very short declarative, like punchy sentence, and then this like crazy carnival of just terrible, mid-Victorian squalor and urban living, with all these like crazy categories and names, stuff like that. And so that was one of those things where like I had the idea for it, probably like months before I actually sat down to write it. Like I knew exactly what it was going to feel like.
One of my favorite things to do that I've been playing around with a lot is really long sentences, like 120, 130 words, and communicating to the reader that sentence is going to be a moment. So maybe there's something really serious and the writing is clear words, lots of Anglo-Saxon words that are short, they're direct, and we're getting a boom, 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 boom to the writing. And I'm over time beginning to expand into more romantic language, French-inspired prose, and then adding a little bit more energy. And then I sort of lead into this crescendo of a super long sentence. And when you sit down and you say, how is this like 130 word sentence? How is it going to be? And how am I going to make the reader implicitly, intuitively understand that this is going to be a moment? How do I do that through the construction of what I'm writing? I don't yet have answers, but it's been something that I've been playing around with and having a lot of fun with.
It's a really great idea. So I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is I'm kind of a recovering long sentence writer. Like I'm in recovery because I went, so I was a semiotics major in college and basically kind of studied like critical theory, post-structuralism, whatever you want to call it, Derrida and Foucault and all these kind of folks who were very much in vogue in the late 80s. And I went to grad school in English literature. And so all my heroes like wrote these incredibly Baroque sentences that had a million parentheses in the middle to qualify the words. Like when I want to put that word under erasure, even as I talk about the existence of language. But as an aside, before I even get to the main point of the sentence, I just want to say this other thing here. And so like that was my like natural kind of mode. And I had to like unlearn some of that to become the writer that I became. And I do think that I sometimes have overcompensated for that. And I think that a glorious long sentence can be an incredible tool to use as well. But the other thing, I mean, I was thinking as you were describing it that like those set piece sentences are like a big tracking shot in a movie. Like it's like, okay, now we're going to have this crazy tracking shot where we're going to go into the restaurant and we're going to follow them around, whatever. Like, I can't believe it's all one shot. I can't believe they're doing this, this was hard to pull off, and I have, there are a couple of points. Infernal Machine, the new one, is like the most cinematic of all the books, I would say. And there's one of the challenges which is like an architectural challenge and then a challenge on the level of paragraph. So it's kind of fun to think about how these things come together. I wanted to write a preface for the book that would like set up that there was going to be a kind of thriller like structure with like literally like ticking clock bombs and police force and investigators and undercover operations that was coming in this book you're reading. Because the next thing you're going to get for the first story of the book is all these different threads starting in Russia and these Russian anarchists and these French police officers, and you weren't really going to know where it was coming. So I wanted to plant a bomb in the preface. And so there is a bomb that goes off in the basement of the NYPD in summer of 1915. And so I was trying to figure out like how I could create that kind of tension. And I finally ended up ending the preface as this old riff where it's like, if there was any place that embodied the kind of clash between the new science of investigation and the terrorist movements of the day, it was probably the NYPD and the Identification Bureau at the NYPD. And, it was this night in 1915 and it's bustling with energy because there's just been this case has happened or whatever. And then I was like, I really want to convey the camera like pulling out of that room and going down the stairs and seeing a briefcase suspiciously left in the doorway and the sound of like a clock ticking inside of the briefcase.
Nice.
And so I had to kind of like, so the final paragraph is kind of like, but it's not just the activity upstairs that would tell you this is interesting. Like you'd have to really understand what was going on. You'd have to walk out and walk down the stairs, and kind of recreated that shot without actually saying like, imagine this is a movie, So like that's kind of one of those wonderful things where you're like, you're trying to do something very visual and cinematic in a way on the level of like 5 or 6 sentences. But the work that it's doing is all about supporting the entire architecture of the book. Because you're like, I have to make this little moment so memorable that they tolerate all the crazy journey that they're going to be on before they get back to it.
Well, you're talking about writing for video. You've made a PBS documentary.
Yeah.
So how is that different for writing for for text?
We did 2 of them actually. How We Got to Now and Extra Life we also did. How We Got to Now was interesting because we did they're book versions of each of those. How We Got to Now, I really wrote it as a book as we were making the show. So there were some places where we did a script. The chapters of that book correspond to the episodes. There were 6 episodes, six chapters. And so in some cases we wrote a script first and then I adapted it into a chapter, and sometimes I wrote a chapter first. And so by far it was the most collaborative. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted me to submit a book for kind of best writing prize, I wouldn't submit that. I think because if there's any way to be lazy, you will always choose to be lazy in your writing. Like if like the problem I had with that book was like, if the script had been written, there was a bunch of language describing the invention of air conditioning, say, that was, in the script. And I'm sitting here being like, all right, now I have to describe the invention of air conditioning. And I'd be like, well, a paragraph is right there and I have the rights to it. Like I could, and so, and TV language is different from my style of book language, stuff like that. And I think you can feel that a little bit in, for instance, Wonderland, the book that came after that, was going to be a TV show, and then it's kind of second season of how we got to now. And interestingly, we couldn't get funding for it, which is annoying. PBS wanted to do it, but we couldn't get funding, so it never became a TV show. But I wrote the book first, and the style of it is very different. But I did like, it was a reminder of how solitary, if you're writing books, like generally it's one of the most solitary jobs until the book comes out. And then it's a very, very public job for like 3 weeks if you're lucky. And everybody's like critiquing your work and you're out talking to people about it, stuff like that. And then you go back to this very like private world. But the shows were fun, and working on NotebookLM is fun because it's so much more collaborative. So it's a nice change of pace to just have other people.
Yeah. I guess this did happen. You walk into a college classroom and you say, all right, this is going to be the Steven Johnson writing class. How do you structure the curriculum? What do students need to know that you can uniquely teach?
I mean, I think there's some little hacks that some of which we've talked about, just about like the workflow, the way you edit, the way you read, but I think the thing that I have thought about and kind of push the envelope as much as most folks is using the digital tools as a research and collaborative kind of thinking mode, whether it's NotebookLM or even Think or Scrivener, which I've used for many years and loved. And just that idea that, the software has become vastly more helpful in coming up with ideas and organizing your ideas and making new connections, that, it's not just anymore about just being able to search and find the thing you want, but actually can be part of the creative process in a really kind of profound way. I think that's probably that's why people would be attending the class, I think, would be to get those kinds of insights. Another thing that I wrote about a little bit with my use of Scrivener, that's related to the hunch idea, but slightly different, which is this kind of idea of clustering of ideas. So, and NotebookLM can do this as well. I did it kind of manually in Scrivener. So for instance, with Wonderland, which is a book about the history of play and delight and amusement and how it drove a lot of surprising innovations. It's a very open-ended topic, right? I knew I was going to write a little bit about music. I knew I was going to write about like early automata, like robots and things like that. And I knew I was going to write about spices because that was interesting, but it could be anything, right? So I would just like collect snippets of things. And I kind of read very widely, and I would just kind of throw the quotes into Scrivener. And Scrivener has this very elegant mode for kind of like, you can have these little atomic units that can be quotes or little notes and things like that. And then you can kind of just drag them into folders. And so I would kind of like be kind of looking at all the snippets and be like, it seems like there's an interesting little cluster here about the connection between robotics and music that I hadn't really seen before, but like there's something there. Like I've noticed there are like 8 things there. And so I would kind of like create a little mini folder for robotics and music, and I'll just drag a bunch of the clips in there. And then you would kind of see like over time, like, oh, that pile, like you'd have these little piles of kind of like fragmentary ideas, like piles of hunches, basically, to keep the metaphors intact. And eventually you kind of look down and you'd be like, oh, I got like 3 or 4 big piles here. Like this one's really developed, this one's really developed, this one's really developed. And at that point, one of the cool things about the interface of Scrivener is you can take all those little snippets and just turn them into a single document very easily. So we kind of borrowed that. Notebook has a feature that is combined to single notes. So you can grab a bunch of notes and whoop, put them into one note, so you can then kind of treat them like a document. And that process is kind of like, once you get a big enough kind of pile of interesting ideas that seem to be clustering around a certain idea, you're kind of like, all right, that's a chapter.
Yes.
But you have to go through that process of like, I'm sure it's different if you're like writing a like very traditional biography or something like that, where like the structure is really like anchored in events that are known, that you have a timeline before you start. But I think for most books, like that structure is really open-ended at the beginning. And so you got to figure out what are the little clusters of ideas that fit together?
The word that's coming to mind for me is emergence.
Yeah. No, it's a very bottom-up kind of way. Very bottom-up, which was, yes, you're alluding to my second book, Emergence. Yeah, and like, in a way, the trickiest book like that for me was Where Good Ideas Come From, which was ultimately organized in these kind of patterns of innovative environments. So it talked about slow hunches, liquid networks, adjacent possibles, serendipity, error, one or two others. And it took me months and months and months to figure out that structure. I had a million stories and a million kind of lessons, but I just didn't know how to cluster them. And I had in kind of building on Emergence in a way, I had this initial idea that it would be kind of across scales. And so there'd be a chapter about how innovation and creativity works on the level of brain science. And then it would be like your workspace. And then it would be like the office. And then it would be like this city. And then it would be like the media platform or whatever. And like each chapter would kind of you'd go up the chain like that. And I tried to write that. I think I did a few drafts of chapters like that. And it got you got stuck at each level.
Sure.
So you're in the brain chapter, you were just reading neuroscience stuff. And then you got to the cities and it was Jane Jacobs, it was and the whole fun of that book was I'm going to take you from here and there. I'm going to take you all, connect all these different ideas, all these places, but each chapter got too siloed. And so I finally, and this is actually when I started using Scrivener. Scrivener had a kind of note card interface. I didn't actually write that book in Scrivener, but I organized it with the note cards. I wrote it, I think, in Word. I think it may be the last book I wrote in Word. But you could kind of drag around these note cards in Scrivener. And so that was the way I was okay, I can see these different patterns. Now I can figure this out. But it was really, really hard. And it's in some ways is the hardest, for me, it's the hardest part of it. Although I think it's one of the things that I do best. But it just takes a lot of thinking.
I asked about the class that you would teach, and something I want to try with our Rite of Passage students is an exercise where you take a paragraph, and then what you do to develop your voice is we have 8 different images of architectural styles, Arts, Baroque, Modernist, and then Brutalist, and you rewrite the paragraph based on the architectural styles.
I love that.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah, that's a great idea. So that's even more clever than something I used to do consciously. So when I was in college and I was, kind of writing in this literary theory mode, I would deliberately write papers in the style of I'd be okay, this paper is written in the style of Michel Foucault. And then I'll be this paper is written in the style of Gayatri Spivak or whatever. And I would kind of try and it ended up you eventually build your own voice out of some weird mix of all those different styles.
I would say imitate then innovate.
Yeah.
You start off, you're imitating other people. It's sort of I love it when you go to the Met and somebody has the easel and the canvas and they're sketching the statue or the painting in front of them. I was at where was I? I think it might have been the British Museum. I know it was in London. I think it was the British Museum or the National Gallery. And there was this guy, and he's sketching this beautiful Greek statue with this movement and this flow. And I went up to him and I'm like, what are you trying to get at? He's like, well, I'm trying to sketch that, but I'm trying to exaggerate the motion. So in the statue, there's no wisps. But in my drawings, I can sort of add these lines and I can create this movement with my pen that doesn't actually exist there. I'm trying to communicate that. And I was like, yes, that is exactly how an artist should be thinking. It is the imitation, try to copy it and bring it into your own field of view, but then to add something and not just copy, but to really be generative there too.
And that actually continued on. I mean, I remember I was still kind of coming out of the academic prose style. So I started writing kind of journalism in like 94 and 95, right as I was doing stuff on the web for the first time. And Gladwell started publishing in the New Yorker right around that point.
Yeah.
And I remember just being struck by he would often end sections with very short, punchy little, 5-word sentences. And like, I don't think I had written a 5-word sentence in like 15 years at that point. Like I just been like, all my sentences were like 100 words long. And I was like, oh, that's so nice. Like you can write longer but you just get to the end of that section, you're like, boom, there's just this little button at the end and it's done. And so I remember thinking that. I remember before I wrote Ghost Map, I read Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, which was kind of like, I was reading it somewhat to prep myself to write. It was the first book that I'd written in kind of historical narrative mode. And so just like how which also had a kind of thriller detective structure, but was also trying to recreate a city in time, Chicago in that case, not London. But so it had a lot of commonality. So it was just like studying like the way that he did that. And I went back to Larson's book, actually, The Splendid and the Vile, that he just came out with, because Infernal Machine has a lot of dialogue, because there's so many autobiographies that have been written. Emma Goldman, most famously, the anarchist. And then there's so many contemporaneous news reports where seemingly these reporters are like in the events as they're happening. It's very weird. And so I didn't have to invent any dialogue, which I would never do. I just had whole scenes where like conversations are on the record, like they're part of the historical record. And so I could recreate what people said to each other. And I never really had that before. I had a little bit of that in Enemy, but not very much. And so Larson's book, Splendid and the Vile, does the same thing, because he had all these diary entries during London during the Blitz. And so I was like, okay, now I'm gonna, there's another novelistic feeling to this book here that I've never really done. So I want to look at another nonfiction writer who's done it in that way. So
What'd you learn?
I'm not even sure if it's, in some of those things, it's not even conscious. You're just kind of like, you just get a feel for like how it's going to work, and you just kind of, then you just remember that tone.
Yeah, I remember I had a conversation with my grandpa before he died, when we had a piece of paper, we were throwing him in the trash. I was looking at the trash can, and I was like, okay, I'm going to think about this. He's like, stop thinking. You're actually way better when you just throw the paper in the trash can. And I was like, wow, Grandpa, you're right. I could just sort of look, throw. And there's something about the consciousness, like a lot of, especially with these sorts of things, the body just knows, but before the mind even figures out what's going on.
And I think that's the style thing is very interesting, because it often is something that you just, you get in, you slowly develop a groove for a certain kind of style that you get by just reading other people and reading yourself, and you slowly kind of get to it. But it's often not, the architecture stuff that we've spent so much time talking about is very conscious. You're very much aware, like, I am trying to figure out what is the structure for this book and what should the first chapter be. Like, it's, but like, what is the vibe of this sentence, or the way that I write is less deliberate, I think, sometimes. And that is one of the places where I think, again, the AI story has been so fascinating, and you really see this with the visual models like DALL-E, but it's true also of the language models, which is the ability of these machines to capture style. Like, that you can say, I want a picture of like Pokemon in the style of Rembrandt, and it really like seems to get the style of Rembrandt in this way that you would have thought that was, yeah, okay, you can learn to identify a Pokemon versus, a person, but that you could capture like the style of a painter in a really clever way, just by like predicting the next pixel, which is basically all they do, is astonishing.
I want to close with one final question. What do you think is the core idea that your work is orbiting around? Because I see two parallel tracks, and I've been thinking about this for the past few hours now, of you have this narrative nonfiction drama track, true crime, London, disease, and then you have this fervor for creativity and innovation and connecting ideas. What is the synthesis of those two things? I actually can't find it right now.
I think there are two I do think you could divide my work in books into two different strains. You know, there's a kind of storytelling mode, historical storytelling mode, and then there's the largely history of innovation, kind of how does innovation work. That's mostly what the other books are about in one way or another, and a little bit of kind of science in there. But I think the common theme, you know, in all the history books, I was describing this in a Substack email that I sent out yesterday. There's a whole riff in Infernal Machine about, so much of it is about dynamite and about bombs going off. And so naturally I was like, well, I have to understand what made that wave of dynamite bombs, terrorist actions possible. And so thus I have to understand how dynamite came in the world, which led me back to Alfred Nobel and his life, which is extraordinary, and got me thinking about like the state of chemistry at that particular moment in time, and like why Nobel was able to like invent this thing, and why it basically like ended up getting co-opted by all these political actors, which was not part of his vision at all, which is unintended consequences, and technology is a big part of my obsession in all my books. And so there's always this attempt in the story books and the history books to say, here's what happened, and I'm going to tell you what happened in the most interesting, suspenseful way possible so that you want to keep reading. But I really want to think about why it happened. And like, what were the deeper forces, not just the arc of this person's life and the random collisions of their life, but like, what were the underlying forces that really, you know, when you see paradigm shifts or revolutions, political revolutions, technological revolutions, scientific revolutions, like why did that revolution happen at that moment? Or like, why did terrorism get invented in this particular period of time? Why did the modern surveillance state get invented in response to terrorism in that particular point in time? Those are big questions in Infernal Machine. And so those questions can only be answered across different disciplines and across different scales, time scales.
Right.
So to understand the anarchist bombers, you have to understand the chemistry of dynamite. And you have to understand the economics of dynamite, and you have to understand the political philosophy of anarchism and its relationship to violence, and you have to understand these particular actors in their particular world, and you have to be able to go back in time. In that case, 60 years to Nobel. In other cases and other points, I go back 300, 400 years to tell the story of how India became the richest country in the world at that particular moment in time when Henry Every was a pirate. So I think it's thinking across disciplines and thinking across scales. That's a common theme in the idea books, and it's a common theme in the history books.
And the other words that come to mind is underlying forces. As you said, I really want to call attention to that, because that, when you said those words, I was like, yes, the underlying forces shows up over and over.
Yeah. And what's nice about it is it's an intellectual idea that when you do it right, also carries that same weight of surprise that we were talking about at the beginning. Like, you're surprised by, oh, I didn't think that event was going to happen. And you're surprised by, I had never really thought about the fact that like an invention with like nitroglycerin ended up like influencing like the birth of the FBI. That, like, I didn't think about that connection. And so when you can do that kind of level of surprise where you have a page turner surprise and you have a like deep forces surprise at the same time, like that's the sweet spot that I go for.
Boom, boom. That was fun.
Really fun.
Thanks,
really
man.
enjoyed it. I could do that all day.